Hello again, Perspectives. This is Module 9, Munchausen Syndrome by Proxy and Resilience. Okay, so let's unpack these two concepts. Again, I'm combining two concepts that I think might relate to each other in the sense. Munchausen Syndrome by Proxy is a rare form of child maltreatment in which the caretaker, usually the mom, exaggerates or induces symptoms of physical or psychological illness in a child. So a mother is lying and saying the child is sick or is actually making the child sick. The motivation for this is the sympathy that the mother will get. So this is under the category of a factitious disorder. So factitious disorders are in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So this specific quote comes from the 1994 DSM-4. We're now in the 5th edition. But we classify MSP under the heading of factitious disorders by proxy because the mother is fabricating for benefit. This behavior was first discussed and written in 1951. And so we see exaggeration. This is overstating to increase to an abnormal degree. The mother tells friends online, for instance, that the child has excruciating pain and the child only has a minor stomach ache. So the mother is embellishing. It could also just be a flat out lie, fabricating to falsify something that's not even true. Mother tells church congregation that the child has cancer. The mother then shaves the child's head, takes her picture in front of the hospital, and the child does not have cancer. So inducing symptoms or falsifying symptoms that are completely not true. And although this is rare, it has been documented. The median age for diagnosis was 2.5 years old. 66% of victims under the age of 5. If a child is under the age of 5, it would be it would be the easiest to fabricate this. The child can't disrupt or dispute, and their ability to understand, although children who are 2.5, 3, 4, 5 can communicate. They actually can communicate in forensic interviews. They can communicate with interviewers and investigators, but they are not really given to a lot of abstract thought. So that the concept that I'm really not sick, mom is saying I'm sick because she has some emotional need that will be gratified by lying about my sickness, that's kind of abstract. Children can say, Uncle Johnny hit me with the belt in the face and it left a bobo. Or Uncle Johnny touches me in a way I don't like. Or, Aunt Jill showed me bad movies. Right? So we can see these kind of very concrete statements kids say, but the abstract principle of Munchausen syndrome can be lost at times. It can be very confusing and complex. So victims include children from 1 month to 21 years of age. Now, the older a child gets, the more complex and the more oftentimes overt. 25% of all victims are older than 6 years of age. So for instance, a 14-year-old boy underwent 40 surgeries between the ages of 8 and 14. The boy later said that his mother beat him when he objected and rewarded him after the surgeries. So the mother has got to be very overt in her reasoning and rationale. At some point, she's got to say, you're going to tell the doctors that you are sick. And if you don't, I'm going to beat you. and if you do, I will reward you. So at some point, young children, the more capable they are of understanding abstract thought, and at some point mothers will be more concrete in their fabrication. So with risk factors, some women begin with Munchausen syndrome. They fake disorders that they themselves have. Some say this is a misguided cry for help. Survivors say that in a study of 10 adult survivors, the major of adult survivors blamed their mother and saw their father, who failed to intervene, as weak. This is really hard to catch. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is very, very hard because a lot of times if the mother's making the kid sick or kind of inducing symptoms, this is done at the house. So when mothers have been caught inducing sickness, this has been done in the hospital. So what happens is hospital staff become suspicious. They tell authorities, who get a search warrant. A judge approves a search warrant to put a camera in the hospital room. This is very, very rare, but when it has happened, mothers have been caught. Evidence is usually obtained through court-approved surveillance in hospitals. So risk factors. Women begin with Munchausen syndrome, again, extremely rare, extremely traumatic for the child. And so this leads us to think about what are the long-term effects of children who have experienced this. In conclusion, more research is needed because it is always very difficult to catch from a criminal standpoint, and it's difficult to research. If a mother is not going to tell the authorities that she is fabricating her child's illness, if she's inducing the child's illness, this has to occur in secrecy and deception. And usually the only people that would know would be the mother and the child, the teenage child, the older adult child, like a 20-year-old, 18-year-old, 17-year-old at some point. So it could be really hard to research this. Parental care, education, and therapy should be available for parents who feel a need for compassion. So if a mother is needy enough to do something like this, there should be a better way to get them the support they need. So education and vigilance among the medical community is needed. So I wanted to discuss Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Although it is rare, it does affect kids. And if those frontline child abuse workers, child abuse intervention and prevention personnel, as well as teachers, coaches, clergy, this may not ever come into their mind. They may feel something is off with a mother-child interaction or a caregiver-child interaction. They may feel in their gut something's off and have no idea, but if they understand what Munchausen syndrome by proxy is, at least it's something that they could investigate or look for. So resilience, that leads us to thinking about the child. If you happen to be a child whose mother induced sickness in your own life or told people you were sick when you weren't, what are the impacts? Now let's broaden the discussion. So what would be the long-term impact if you were a child who was physically abused, sexually abused? So that leads us to resilience. Research has been done over the years on resilience because we're interested in how we can help children recover. Being able to recover easily from difficult circumstances is resilience. It's the ability to bounce back and persevere it's being able to adjust to misfortune, and overall it's adaptation. So can an experience that's so negative eventually give way to positive emotions? And even while difficulty is happening, can you experience joy in the midst of it? Resilience is viewing negative events as a challenge. The basic safety needs must be met, though. We can't talk about resilience unless a child is safe. We can't talk about resilience until a child is making progress physically, mentally, spiritually. So when we start thinking about resilience, we can think of this as sort of kind of a conclusion of most everything that we'll talk about in this class. But it is difficult to measure. How do you measure a child who has been abused, when in many cases it can be really, really hard to even get kids to admit that they have been mistreated? So now when we talk about the victim survivor continuum, okay, there comes a point in time when victims become survivors, where they stop thinking of themselves as I'm a victim and I'm a survivor. Yes, this happened, but I'm moving on. And at some point, we may not even know when a child crosses that threshold, and after they cross that threshold, perhaps they have bad days. It seems something that is so abstract. How would we measure when someone says, I'm a survivor, I'm not a victim, this doesn't define me anymore? Actually, if we're measuring resilience, we could say a child could be resilient in one area while lagging behind in another. Some children feel they are more socially competent than they are. This is also a problem in research. So a child would say, yeah, my social skills are great. The abuse did not impact my social skills. But you talk to their teachers, their parents, you talk to their friends, they would say that's not true. They're struggling. Some maltreated children report competence socially, and their teachers would actually disagree. So resilience across the lifespan, not just in childhood, but what are the long-term effects of the abuse, is hard to measure. For one thing, you have the longitudinal effect. It's hard to just follow a kid for 25 years, let alone an entire sample. So if we take a sample of mistreated children, maltreated children, we got 1,000 kids in our research, and you want to follow them for even 7 years. A lot of them are going to move, they're going to stop responding. So it can be difficult just pragmatically. We look at the incidence rate. The measure of resilience yields different data. So when we operationally define resilience, one study uses the mini battery of achievement. And this found 75% of maltreated children score 1 standard deviation below the average. This is from Walsh, et al. 2010. So a mini battery essentially is several tests, several short tests, and when this was used on a sample, it found that children are 1 standard deviation below. That means, think of a standard deviation as a standard unit of measurement. So if resilience is defined as 1 standard deviation above the mean, then their percentage of resilient children fell to 22%. So essentially what we're saying is, how many kids who were abused are actually doing better than their peers? Okay, so in academic performance, let's say a C average. Okay, so if resilience is defined as a C average, then that's passing. But if resilience is defined as I have survived and I'm advancing, I am making progress. If it's defined as a B average, then only really 22% of children in the sample could be identified as resilient. It is important to see how resilience is operationally defined. And what that means is take it from an article-to-article basis, a study-to-study basis. How are the authors of this research defining resilience? So factors with resilience, the level of trauma suffered. If we have a child who has been a victim of sexual battery, as opposed to a child who has been a victim of molestation, can we say that the child who was a victim of molestation is not as traumatized as the child who was a victim of sexual battery? Not always, because sexual battery is more invasive physically, but sexual abuse doesn't just affect one physically, it affects them emotionally, it affects them in a myriad of ways. We also have to look at family caregiver support, community factors, victim characteristics, interaction of genes and the environment. But all that said, we go back to the traumagenic dynamic model of Finkler and Brown in the 80s. These things were all taken into account. So so the more invasive the abuse, if the abuse was very invasive, if mother was not supportive, if the child was exposed to a lot of adverse childhood experiences, they also were in poverty, they also were in a high crime area with few academic research or academic support areas, support systems available, but also victim characteristics. Did they have personality issues, mental health issues? In the interaction of their genes, the genetic piece. Perhaps all of these traumas then trigger some other genetic issues. Now, you don't ever have, sometimes we have abuse resilience, it's nuanced. So we have children sometimes who they may have a very strong supportive family, and they may have a really strong personality and a lot of gifts, and they're doing well in school, but they were exposed to intense child abuse and trauma in one isolated incident. So it's not really comparing apples to apples. It is really prismatic. There's lots of different variables that we need to take into account. So let's take these factors and dig a little bit deeper. So in terms of the level of trauma, Liam et al. In '97, among sexual abuse survivors, studied low to moderate level trauma and found that this increased resilience. High and severe abuse decreased resilience. Overt physical abuse predicted less resilience and greater trauma. So when you have violent sexual abuse, so you have a child who's sexually abused and in a violent way, adding physical and sexual abuse together decreased resilience. So family and caregiver support. Resilient people report having a supportive adult, such as a parent, foster parent, or a teacher, somebody in their life that will go to bat for them. Community factors. Community support is also associated with resilience. If survivors have a supportive adult and a community support system, they will persevere and have great resilience. So this is good schools, high quality health care, child advocacy, trauma-focused, child-friendly therapeutic services, religious organizations, libraries, recreational opportunities, victim characteristics. Fourth, what is the temperament of the child? Children with an easy temperament are more likely to be resilient than other kids. Victim characteristics continued. Temperament of the child does impact resilience. Positive self-esteem is associated with resilience. Does the child just genuinely feel good about themselves? Survivors described as ego resilient, ego over control report high resilience. So ego resilience is resourcefulness. Ego over control is the ability to exert control over one's own impulses. So emotional regulation, controlling your own self, your own outbursts of emotion, these things are also positively correlated with resilience. Resilient survivors disclose abuse. They discuss their abuse with discretion. So they know when and when not to share. They know to whom and to whom not to share. They minimize the abusive experience in a sense of saying, not that it didn't happen. Yes, it happened, but it's not going to keep me from accomplishing my dreams, my goals, my aspirations. They attempt to reframe the experience in a more positive way, and they refuse to dwell on the experience. Himmeline and McGrath in 1996. So, other victim characteristics. Goals are important to them. They enjoy the work involved in meeting goals. They are committed to completing tasks, even in the face of failure. Resilient children are usually optimistic. They are hopeful. They have faith that life is meaningful. And they have an internal locus of control. This is the tendency to attribute the cause of events to themselves. And so essentially what they're saying is that I can control my response to an event. A person with an external control, a locus of control, would say things like, I'm a victim of circumstance, or the devil made me do it is an external locus of control, or I was running with a bad crowd. These are things outside of me affecting me. Those who have a high internal locus of control have a higher self-esteem and a lower depression. Fifth, Caspi et al. In 2003 researched children with stressful experiences. This led to depression in some, but not others. They focused on the gene that regulates serotonin levels in the brain. Serotonin is associated with mood regulation, sleep, and memory. Serotonin is low in those who are depressed. A Kaufman study, et al. 2006, studied a sample of 196 children. 109 were maltreated, 87 were not. They found the highest level of depression in the children with two short 5-HTT alleles. It's a history of maltreatment and poor social support. So they find a link between genetics and those who are depressed, have poor social support. And so what we know is that the environment and our experiences impact our genes in real time. This was really discovered by the decoding of the human genome. You can think of a bad experience as triggering your genetic loading. So you have genes, and they're within our bodies, and these genes kind of are triggered, and they then can produce a host of effects. So Hopefully this helps us see that resilience is a dynamic process. Even something as horrible as Munchausen syndrome, child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, human trafficking, um, adverse childhood experiences, we do see children recover. We do see children resilient. We need to do our best to recognize abuse when it happens, to do what is necessary to report it, to be a part of a team, multidisciplinary team, to help ensure that the system is working well. And hopefully we can do everything that in our power to improve the response to these horrible things, to prevent horrible things, and to do our part. Okay, so thank you so much for your participation in this. I look forward to hearing about what you have to say on the discussion boards. All right, take care.